audience. I was just telling Zareer just now, and welcome Zareer. Who is the big attraction today? Churchill or you? Not me. Not me at all. But thank you so much on behalf of the Museum Society and Simrose Art Gallery for agreeing to give us this lecture on Churchill and Indian independence. I would also like to thank the artist who's exhibiting with us right now, Hari Katragade. And if you have time, do look around the show. He's a physicist, but he's been very interested in cyanotype photography. And all these prints are of the Ganges, from Kanpur to Benares. You never step into the same river twice. And if you look at it with that lens, and if you look at it with the lens of the pollution that is there, many types of pollution, especially industrial pollution and the tanneries in Kanpur, right down to the Ghats, and I leave the rest to your imagination. So I'm grateful to Hari for allowing us this 3 hours, 2 hours in the evening during his exhibition. And I'm also very happy that everybody's friend here this evening, Dr. Zareer Masani, agreed in November last year that he would address the society and the gallery with a talk which I left, the topic of which I left for him to decide. I'm just going to say a few words. It's in the invitation, so it's not new, but Churchill's critics hold him responsible for everything from failed constitutional progress in British India to the cataclysmic force of partition. This is a line of argument that plays well in chauvinist discourse. But does it offer original insights into either Churchill's politics or his impact on Indian affairs? Dr. Masani will address this question. And does the evidence really support such extreme conclusions? Because this is going on YouTube, please indulge me. Dr. Masani is the author of Macaulay, Britain's Liberal Imperialist, published by Bodley Head in 2014. He has an Oxford History Doctorate and is the author of 3 other historical books: Indira Gandhi, a biography published by Hamish Hamilton in 1975, Indian Tales of the Raj, produced for BBC in 1987, and India from Raj to Rajiv, also produced by the BBC in 1988. He has also written a widely acclaimed family memoir, And All Is Said, Memoir of a Home Divided, published by Penguin in 2013. For the last 2 decades, Zareer has been a current affairs producer for the BBC and is now a freelance historian, journalist, and broadcaster. He has presented and produced several documentaries for BBC Radio 4. Zareer's particular areas of interest are UK race relations, British imperial history, and the legacies of the Raj in India. So, ladies and gentlemen, please do join me for a round of applause for our speaker this evening, Dr. Zareer Masani. Thank you very much, Zareer.
Right. Well, thank you very much for coming. Some of you are friends and have heard my views before, so forgive me if it's a bit repetitive. I am going to talk about Churchill and India in a fairly wide-ranging way, and I'm going to start with the main charge that is leveled against Churchill by the anti-Churchill decolonizing brigade, by which I mean William Dalrymple and Shashi Tharoor and Satnam Sanghera and Priya Satya and so on. Anyway, the main charge is that he in some way engineered, caused the Bengal famine and was responsible for the 2 million people who died then. So, taking this first, I would like to dispel a few myths because I think all famine experts agree that no individual causes a famine. In the case of Bengal, famines have been cyclical, and there was a particular reason for the 1943 famine. Sorry, are you hearing me all right? Which was, maybe not at the back, I'll try and speak louder, which was caused to a large extent by World War II, which was raging in 1943, and the Japanese invasion, which was affecting Bengal especially, and had led to all the boats in Bengal having to be destroyed to prevent them being appropriated by the Japanese. So that affected distribution of food grains. Also, imports from Burma were cut off by the Japanese submarines in the Bay of Bengal, Japanese occupation of Burma. So there was not, as Amartya Sen has said, there wasn't a supply crisis in Bengal. There was a distribution demand crisis. The quantity of food grains was the same as the year before. There was also considerable mismanagement. I think Amartya Sen uses the words callousness and confusion caused by the elected government of Bengal. I think people don't realize Bengal was being governed by an autonomous Muslim-led coalition government at the time, headed by Fazlul Haq, the Krishak Praja Party, and they missed the significance of the famine until much later. So the Bengal administration was to a large extent to blame in the immediate cause of the famine. The viceroy in Delhi kept asking the war cabinet in London for food grains from Australia and Canada. Australian shipments were greatly inhibited by Japanese submarines in the Bay of Bengal. Nevertheless, the War Cabinet minutes, which I've studied in some detail, they're available online if anyone wants to, from the Churchill archive at Cambridge. They're all digitized, and I have sort of quarried them, and there's evidence to confirm, along with Government of India minutes, that Churchill's War Cabinet shipped 1 million tons of food grains to Bengal in the famine year. He also appointed Archibald Wavell as the new viceroy to replace the rather lethargic Lord Linlithgow. Wavell's instructions from the War Cabinet, which I've read, are to do everything to end the famine. So it's a total myth to say Churchill wanted Bengalis to starve. There was, World War II at its height at the time. Britain was fighting with its back to the war. So there was certainly no conspiracy to deprive Bengal of food grains, everything to supplement Bengal's food grains, and to break a crisis which was to a large extent created by, I'm sorry to say, Marwari Hindu merchants. Apologies to Marwaris in the audience, but there was antagonism between the grain merchants, who were predominantly Marwari Hindus, and the Muslim-led coalition government. And this, as in India happens, it affected supplies. Now, coming on to, so I think the shipments of food grains were very rapidly started. Australia supplied a great deal. There's records to show Churchill approaching Roosevelt for Canadian supplies. Of course, Allied shipping was in demand for shipments of troops at the time, so one had to really fight to get those shipments. And Wavell certainly did his bit. Now, one of the reasons that Churchill was blamed for the famine was there was a book which you may have heard of by a Bengali American journalist. She's not a historian, called Madhushri Mukherjee, who wrote Churchill's Secret War. And as the title suggests, her main aim was, and Amartya Sen has said this in a rather acrimonious correspondence he had with her in the New York Times, that her main aim was to nail Churchill. Anyway, moving on from there, I think Madhushri Mukherjee's book was basically, as Amartya Sen said, out to nail Churchill, and she missed the other reasons for the famine as a result. And Amartya Sen has been much more balanced and nuanced in his criticisms of the handling of the famine, which certainly was mismanaged, but it was all over more or less within a year. I mean, all famines have after effects of malnutrition, etc. And of course, the figures get completely inflated by the fantasists who, from 2 million, they become 4 million, and so it goes on. I have to say, incidentally, taking some credit for the ending of the famine was my own grandfather, Sir J.P. Srivastava, who was a civil defense member in Churchill's executive council. He was parachuted into the food portfolio to end the famine, and he ended it within a year because he was a very efficient businessman, industrialist, and he got the supplies moving, and he was able to tackle the Hindu grain merchants as a Hindu himself. So moving on, I think I mentioned Madhushri Mukherjee. A more recent book, which some of you may have come across on Churchill in India, is by a British gentleman farmer who's taken to history, someone called Walter Reed. He's not taken very seriously, and he's written a whole chain of books about different British prime ministers. His last one was defending Neville Chamberlain from the usual criticisms, and the next one was the other side of the coin, which was basically lampooning Churchill. Now, Reed has kind of, if you're interested, I did a long review of his book in Open Magazine. Reed has dismissed Madhushri Mukherjee's book and said that Churchill was in no way responsible for the Bengal famine. However, he has gone on to say that Churchill, for some reason, had a totally irrational, obsessive hatred of India and did everything he could to frustrate India's political development. So I'm going to really try and counter this totally unhistorical assertion, because firstly, Churchill had a brief stint in India as a cavalry officer at the turn of the century. He had no strong feelings about India. He didn't mix particularly, as most officers didn't. What one needs to remember is that Churchill was very much a product of his times. He was born in Victorian England. He was undoubtedly racist, as were most Victorians of the time, and as were most Indians. It was a time when no upper caste Indian would even dine with a lower caste, not even let the shadow of a Harijan fall in their path. So these were times when most people in most developed societies were considerably much more racist than they are today. So Churchill was no exception. He certainly regarded the British and their constitutional parliamentary democracy as the acme of political development, and very benevolent to the rest of the world where they could export it. He was very critical of the French for not having developed a system like that. So, those prejudices were very much of his time. Now, I have certainly found no evidence that he had it in for India. He made comments which, he loved to make comments in order to shock. And he particularly liked to shock his rather liberal Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, who had been at school with him at Harrow. And Churchill had, teased him and thrown him into the swimming pool in his dinner jacket, etc. And, there was a kind of long history of them teasing not Churchill teasing Amery. Amery grew up into a rather pompous and long-winded gentleman whom Churchill often cut short with something designed to shock him in the War Cabinet or in private. Amory, to Churchill's surprise, wrote all this down in his journals, which were published in the 1970s, I think, and they were great grist to Madhushri Mukherjee's mill, because he said things like, I hate Indians, they are a beastly people with a beastly religion. Now, he was very much referring there to Hindus, and he was saying this in 1942, when he felt Gandhi had stabbed Britain in the back by launching the Quit India movement. So it was said in a moment of considerable anger. It was said to shock Amory as well, and Amory wrote it down. And they had a little spat, and Amory said, "Oh, you sound like Adolf Hitler," and Churchill laughed it off in that. But Amory wrote it down in his journals, which were later published. So remarks like that were, very much used in evidence against him. But I think everyone who really has examined Churchill's biography and his life knows that he often said things he didn't mean and liked to shock people quite often. And I think the political context is important. Having said that, Churchill certainly had much more respect for the so-called martial races in India, as did most British administrators, especially the Muslims. They shared a common monotheistic religion, biblical roots, etc. So he was always very partial to Indian Muslims. He saw them as a potentially oppressed minority, and he was always very sympathetic to minorities. I think most people are aware how much commitment and sympathy he felt for German Jews and the assistance he provided to kinder transport, etc. So, moving on from there, I want to come to Churchill's role in Indian politics, moving on from his attitudes. And I think the fact of the matter is that Churchill had virtually no impact on Indian politics, nor did he intervene in any way, because most political developments that were happening in the 1930s, Churchill was in the political wilderness. I think one thing which is, I forgot to mention, which is certainly interesting in terms of Churchill's attitude to India was, I think, I don't know if people are aware, that he took a leading role in condemning the Jallianwala massacre in 1919. He was Secretary of War at the time, so he was in charge of General Dyer, who committed the atrocity. Churchill made a very important speech in Parliament, in the House of Commons at the time, which completely swayed the debate in the House against Dyer, and he was cashiered by Churchill and retired. So he described the Jallianwala massacre as a monstrosity, which was the most un-British event that could have happened, and he totally condemned it. So I think that also has to be taken in tandem with his rather anti-Indian comments. Now, moving on to Indian politics, as I said, Churchill was in the political wilderness through the 1930s. He was a Tory backbencher. He had no influence on political and constitutional developments in India. And the 1930s were a very crucial time in India's development, because there were the Roundtable Conferences of 1930-31, at which Churchill was in no way in attendance. He had no impact on them. And then out of those conferences came the 1935 Government of India Act, which gave India the kind of democracy that Britain had had a century before. In other words, what happened was 30 million Indians, 1/6 of the adult population, men and women, were given the vote, You had to be a matriculate and you had to pay taxes. And it introduced full provincial autonomy. So you had elected provincial legislatures with responsible ministries, which were responsible for virtually everything. The governor had a few reserve powers, and the center had a few reserve powers, which is why I mentioned Bengal had a democratically elected government, which is one of the reasons why the viceroy didn't intervene earlier, because they had to let the constitution work. Now, Churchill had no impact on this at all. He was very opposed to the 1935 Government of India Act because some of the clauses of the Act provided for a central government that would also be responsible to an elected legislature, provided the Congress and the Muslim League and the princes could agree on this federation. So it was meant to be a federal elected center, which would then lead to India getting dominion status, which was held out as the goal, like Canada and Australia, and therefore being effectively independent of Britain, but with it tied to the British Commonwealth. Now, Churchill was completely opposed to the Government of India Act because he felt that it would divide India, with Muslims becoming an oppressed minority, and that it would lead to partition. Churchill regarded India as the jewel in the British imperial crown, and that its departure or fragmentation would leave Britain as a second-rate European power. So in some ways he was quite prophetic. I think rather than causing partition, he predicted partition if democracy was introduced at the center without the Congress and the Muslim League agreeing on coalition or power sharing. Now, the responsibility, as some of you may be aware, for the Congress and the Muslim League not reaching agreement on power sharing is to a large extent the responsibility of Nehru, because when the Congress won the UP provincial elections in 1937, it had fought the elections on a joint platform with the Muslim League against the Landlords' Party. It got a majority on its own and decided it could do without the Muslim League. And my father was sitting at Nehru's breakfast table at Anand Bhavan, staying with him at the time, and Nehru sent a telegram in front of him to Gobind Vallabh Pant, who was negotiating with the Muslim League to form a ministry. And he said, you can offer 2 Muslim seats in the cabinet, provided they dissolve the UP Muslim League and merge into the Congress and accept Congress discipline. And my father said, Jawaharlal, you know they won't accept this. And he said, yes, Meenu, that's the point. We don't want them to accept it. And we don't want a coalition. So Nehru basically, this 1937 episode, which I finally persuaded Shashi Tharoor happened, is something that really turned Jinnah very much in favor of the Pakistan demand, which he felt was the appropriate bargaining counter to counter the Congress majoritarianism, which Nehru and Patel, more than Gandhi, reflected. Anyway, so I think to blame Churchill for this is really to largely miss the agency of Indian politicians, which is, I think, what a lot of Churchill's Western critics do, is that they assume that this was all happening in Whitehall, when a lot of it was happening on the ground in the UP and in India. And I mentioned Churchill's role at Jallianwala. I mentioned that there was a promise of dominion status if the main parties in India could agree on a responsible government at the center, a coalition government. Now, the reason that didn't happen is that the 1935 constitution was introduced in 1937. You had elections in the provinces. Congress took office in 6 provincial ministries and got on perfectly well with the governors. Everything was going smoothly. And then came the outbreak of World War II. And the Congress felt it should have been consulted before India declared war. The government of India declared war on Germany. They were not consulted because, there wasn't a responsible government of the center. It was the Viceroy's decision. Congress ministries resigned in protest in 1939, which left the field clear to the Muslim League, which was committed to supporting the war effort, and the Muslim League, filled the political vacuum. And this, to a large extent, was the kind of climate that led to partition. So this had very little to do with, or anything to do with Churchill, because it was to do with events in India which Churchill had no say in. Churchill, as you would know, came back to British politics in 1940 when Chamberlain was seen as having failed. He had very little, at that time or opportunity to affect developments in India. What he did do, I think to a large extent under American pressure, and also the Labour element in his war cabinet. It was a coalition cabinet, and Labour pressed him to make a constitutional offer to India. So I don't know if people are aware of something called the Cripps offer, which was an attempt to get the 1935 constitution back into work and bring back the Congress ministries. And Stafford Cripps was chosen. He was Churchill's Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was chosen to come out to India because he was a friend of Nehru's, and his vegetarianism was meant to endear him to Gandhi, and it was seen as a charm offensive. So Cripps arrived. His offer was a very simple one, which is that if the Congress agreed to support the war effort, the Viceroy would form a national government with both the Congress and the Muslim League and the representatives of the princes. And as soon as the war was over, Dominion status would be enacted, giving India independence, effectively. The Statute of Westminster, which had been adopted in 1931, gave all dominions effective independence with responsible government and the right to secede from the British Empire. So India would have had that right had it achieved a federal central government. The Congress agonized for a bit over the Cripps offer. Some people were in favor of accepting it. Gandhi was not. He called it a post-dated check on a failing bank. That was his famous quote. So he rejected it. Congress voted against it, and Gandhi immediately after that, launched the Quit India movement with some reservations from people like Nehru, who felt there should be support for the war effort. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement and said India could have passive resistance against the Japanese if they enter. The British should leave, and Gandhi would offer passive resistance. Anyway, so the failure of the Cripps offer, to some extent, may have been welcome to Churchill because he was not, as I say, a friend of, majoritarian constitutional development, and also all British politicians at the time, both in the Labour Party and the Tory Party, felt that the middle of a world war was not the time for major constitutional changes in India. That could happen as soon as the war was over. Now, So I think it was important to recognize that there was unanimity in the War Cabinet on this. Churchill was not alone in taking that view, and the Cripps offer, which was made by his cabinet, was turned down by Gandhi, and might well have avoided partition if the Congress and Muslim League had then formed a coalition uh, as suggested by Cripps. Now, thank you. I think anyone who looks at the situation at the time would see that had Nehru and Jinnah agreed on power sharing, there would have been no way for Churchill or any other British politician to refuse Dominion status and responsible government at the end of the war. So I think that, the key responsibility for partition, I think, has to rest with Indian and Pakistani politicians, not with someone who is thousands of miles away, who was in opposition in the wilderness. In fact, people called him an object of derision on the Tory backbenches. No one took him seriously. He wasn't able to get a single amendment to the 1935 Constitution. And as soon as the war was over, the British public voted the Labour Party into office, and Churchill was again in opposition. So he had no say in the last stage, which was, some of you may have heard of the Cabinet Mission Plan, which Attlee, the Labour Prime Minister, sent out. Attlee was a friend of Nehru's, but he still couldn't persuade the Congress to give up its majoritarian demands. The Cabinet Mission Plan, which Churchill opposed tooth and nail, but had no influence on, was to create a loose confederation with unpartitioned provinces in Bengal and Punjab, which would be Muslim majority, and the right to secede after 10 years if they wanted to, which it was hoped would not be necessary. But again, the Muslim League reluctantly accepted it. Nehru torpedoed it in a famous press conference he gave off the cuff at the AICC, and said, we'll amend it as we like as soon as we get independence. We'll have a majority in the Constituent Assembly. And the whole plan collapsed, hence partition. Now, politics apart, I think there's very little doubt if you read a sort of balanced biography like Andrew Roberts' monumental biography of Churchill, that he had quite a romantic fascination with India, a genuine admiration for what he saw as the civilizing benefits of British rule, and a deep pessimism about it all falling apart under democratic pressures. He repeatedly voiced his admiration for the gallantry of Indian troops. So there was nothing anti-Indian about that. I quote from his war memoirs, quote, "The unsurpassed bravery of Indian soldiers and officers, both Muslim and Hindu, shine forever in the annals of war. Upwards of 2.5 million Indians volunteered to serve in the forces. The response of the Indian peoples, no less than the conduct of their soldiers, makes a glorious final page in the story of our Indian empire." Churchill believed that the Congress was dominated by upper caste politicians who had no regard for India's 70 million untouchables and 80 million Muslims, and would basically run a majoritarian dictatorship of the kind we have now. So in some ways he was quite prophetic. And if you add together the figures he did, which was 70 million Dalits, 80 million Muslims, and the populations of another 70 million of the princely states who were not represented by Congress, he felt this was the majority of the Indian population, and it was the true majority, not some paper majority which the Congress might claim, although it claimed to speak for all Indians. He was also appalled by the actions of Subhash Chandra Bose joining Hitler and the Japanese, and felt that this could lead to a fascistic regime in India if the Japanese won the war. And so his abusive comments about Hindus and Bengalis in particular need to be seen in that context, because Bose had just launched his INA, etc. As I say, Amory took these comments very literally, but I mean, there are always, one can always find comments to the contrary. So the one thing that was quoted by someone who was present at a lunch with Churchill and his war cabinet in July 1944, the Indian statesman Sir Ramaswamy Mudaliar Churchill had brought him into the war cabinet, and Churchill was heard saying to him, the old notion that the Indian was in any way inferior to the white man must disappear, unquote. We must all be pals together, he said. I want to see a great shining India of which we can be as proud as we are of a great Canada or a great Australia, unquote. He referred proudly in other situations to India's growing population under British rule. Again, I quote, it was only thanks to the beneficence and wisdom of British rule in India, free from any hint of war for a longer period than almost any other country in the world, that India had been able to increase and multiply to this astonishing extent. The extent, as you might know, is that from a population of 170 million before British rule in 1750, India ended up at independence with a population of over 400 million. So that's certainly not evidence of mass starvation and maladministration. On another occasion, he told the Spanish ambassador to London, quote, since the English occupation of India, the native population has increased by 200 million, unquote. He contrasted this with the extinction of American Indians, a comparison he loved making on his trips to the United States, much to the irritation of Americans. And so I think one has to see Churchill in context. You have to see the rough with the smooth. You have to see his abusive comments along with his complimentary comments, and the fact that he did not in any direct or indirect way affect political or economic developments in India at the time. And he certainly did not hate Indians, and the words I've just quoted are not the words of someone who hated Indians. He did tend to side with underdogs. He saw the Muslims as the underdogs in a majoritarian India, and we see that today. So I'll stop there.